Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today is actually a special flash episode. As I was engaging with these two gentlemen on X, they both said they had time for a stream, and I thought, well, this is an important topic to discuss. On X, I made a comment that the military-industrial complex, the dismantling of that system is the most important political issue of our country today, and I'm speaking as a U.S. citizen. And there's in that exchange we had on X, Luke says, in responding to me and Rainlord, agreed, is the problem the existence of the military-industrial complex or the quality of the one we have now? If you would like a more efficient military-industrial complex, is the best solution to no longer have one? And that really is the crux of the argument. So my position is this. First of all, when I speak of the military-industrial complex, I mean the combined system that produces what we call the forever wars. Right. The war on terror was considered a forever war. You could argue the Cold War was a forever war. And what ends up happening is you have this perverse incentive structure of what used to be called the emergence of death. And a really good introduction to this is H.C. Engelbrecht's The Emergence of Death, which I first heard about from my Mises days, where he goes through how in the United States, and this is actually published in the 30s, so the proper military-industrial complex hasn't even been built yet. So this is long before Eisenhower's warning about the industrial complex. But he charts how in Europe and specifically North America, these independent arms dealers who are private actors, private corporations, are making money selling weapons. So of course, they stimulate weapons production and wars. A good example would be Basil Zakharov, who was infamous during World War I. He was Greek, but it sold submarines to the Turks because, well, hey, look, he can make money and he can stimulate conflict between Greece and Turkey to make more money. So the fact that he's Greek doesn't really matter that much because he's still giving weapons to the Turks. And so we have this perverse incentive where we have industries, and now in the United States with the military-industrial complex deeply in bed with the government that have an incentive to stimulate wars in order to make profits. Now, how does this fit in with China? And how does this fit in with any of America's enemies over the last century? Well, if you understand the history of the emergence of death, they actively stimulate conflict by arming everybody involved because it's good for business. And then when the shoe drops and the war starts, they can then make more money. So China is perceived to be a threat and an advanced military threat by the United States because over the last 40 years, due to free trade policies, most of America's industry was gutted and sent to China. This isn't new. Anthony Sutton describes how the Soviet Union was built up from nothing with Western capital investment. I've done many videos on that on my channel. I can get into that more later if I need to. But what we see is a trend of these merchants, first before they're formalized in a more competitive market, which leads up to the First World War. And then we have after World War II with the Cold War, this idea of both in the US and the Soviet Union, this entrenched system. Now, that's not the same as a, quote, defense industry. So, for example, prior to 1945, the United States had independent arms contractors. Springfield Armory, I think, was initially a government institution that produced weapons for the government. And so the question then is not that the U.S. should unilaterally disarm, but that the U.S. should not have.
Can I ask that, why would incentives have been different pre-1945 and then suddenly change post? You see my point? There were independent companies who had many of the same incentives. This is not even part of the wider point. It's just nitpicking, but what exactly would have changed? Surely it was all the same. The incentives remained, no?
No. It is all the same. But what changed is as these institutions grew within the both political space and the market space, they more effectively organized for their interests. So at first it was kind of random Wild West thing of like all the different gunsmiths in the 19th century. And then they sort of amalgamated, a la Standard Oil. And that was just the natural progression of this, for lack of a better word, life form.
Okay, fair point. Sorry for interrupting, please.
No, that's okay. So the main point here is that this is a natural evolutionary progression. The problem is, if there's no problem with Engelbrecht's work, it's just written prior to Eisenhower's warning. But he kind of gives you the backstory, because when Eisenhower gives you the warning, a lot of us are like, well, hold up, Eisenhower. How did we get here? He doesn't really tell you. I guess that, he doesn't have to, I suppose, but this is the backstory. And so when someone says that, well, the Soviets are a threat, or the Chinese are a threat, or the Germans in World War II or World War I were threats, most of the reason why that's the case is because these industries stimulated conflict. So let's go back to the 19th century Europe. We had the century of peace from Napoleon until World War I. England had splendid isolation. This was because the diplomats, you can think of like the Congress of Vienna in 1815, were invested in maintaining peaceful relations and stable relations in Europe because they represented the interests of the states that they were in, which have a different set of incentive structures than private arms dealers. And I would argue that World War I and this complete unleashing of death through armaments is the result of these arms dealers taking control over the governments in order to sell more weapons.
Can I make an argument from broader from incentive structures? So
sure.
Look at the Soviet Union, right? And let's go to the Cold War, because you said that was an example of one of these forever wars that the military-industrial complex incentivizes. And I don't doubt that there is an element of, well, there was a great deal of lobbying, and I don't doubt they have influence. But look at it from the other direction. Look at the Soviet Union. They had all of their armaments nationalized. Clearly, there are no private corporations and there aren't private interests in and lobbying in the way that we have in the West, clearly. But there were strong incentives, as there were for the US, for the Soviet Union to conduct a Cold War. You see what I mean? They had and those incentives are much larger. I mean, I'm of the school of kind of John Mearsheimer's realist school, and I think surely that shows that there were very strong incentives for both the Soviet Union and for the US to be in conflict with each other for over a very long period of time. Nothing to do with the structure of the armaments industry and lobbying and so forth. Does that argument make any sense to you?
Well, no, I see what you're saying. So let me, I've done a lot of videos on this elsewhere. So if anybody wants to follow up on what I'm saying, I can direct you to those videos. What Anthony Sutton shows us in his research, he was a old right. So, Rothbard speaks of the old right. He's sort of an old right thinker who's active 60s, 70s, 80s. And he argues and demonstrates from government documents, corporate documents, that from 1920 to 1991, the Soviet Union was on the verge of economic collapse on multiple occasions, and Wall Street firms were constantly bailing them out. The most famous example is the 1971 Great Grain Heist, where in the middle of the Vietnam War, when the Soviets, of course, are supplying North Vietnam with weapons through Haiphong Harbor, are on the verge of a massive famine that could have brought down the government. So what does Nixon do? Nixon organizes with the World Bank and Canada and the US to give them a lucrative grain loan to keep them going. Now, could you imagine during World War II, the United States doing the same thing with Nazi Germany or Japan? No. So what I'm saying is that it was in the interests of the U.S. military-industrial complex to prop up the Soviet Union and to prevent it from failing, at least up until 1991.
Do you think there are other reasons, though, that it might be eminently in the US's interest not to have the Soviet Union collapse in such a spectacular fashion, right? I mean, Soviet Union collapsing was a security nightmare. You had nukes going all over the place and so forth. Like, stability is a goal, is a laudable goal. You see what I mean? Like, I sometimes wonder whether you're just pinning everything back to the military-industrial complex. Do you not think that there might be other reasons that it was helpful, or for example, just to curry favor with the Russians for kind of more peaceful, for better peace talks and for better cooperation in the future? Or maybe I'm just being a little hopeful.
Well, let me put it this way. Are you familiar with the 19th century concept of the Great Game between Russia and Britain in Central Asia?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So Russia in the 20th century is sort of like the Great Game for different financial interests in the West. So the February Revolution of 1917 was funded a lot by the Schiffs, and but then the Bolshevik Revolution, which I actually consider a coup against the February Revolution, was funded by the Warburgs and other business interests. So you have And the reason stated, Sutton goes into the Overman Committee, which was a Senate hearing, a Congress hearing rather, about why Russia fell to the Reds, because ostensibly nobody in the U.S. State Department wanted this to happen. It was illegal to trade with the Russians from 1917 to 1933. It was because they believed that the Bolsheviks would throttle economic development in Russia rather than the Kerenskyites. And so that the goal was to create a captive market to then exploit Russian resources without them becoming a true threat, which they perceived, elements of that business class perceived Kerensky would be. And so it's not uniform, of course. I mean, there are people that push back in different ways, but there's a certain agenda that keeps bubbling to the surface. And that's my point.
Okay, and you know what? I was being a bit contrarian earlier. I do very much take your point that the military-industrial complex does have a malign influence over policy. I think the point I was trying to make in the tweets is always, well, what else? If not this, what else? What would you prefer? What's the alternative, right?
I like to add a point here. Luke, nice to meet you. I'm Rain.
Good to
Just
meet
as
you.
a background, I'm an engineer. I work as an engineer. And in my free time, I actually recently did some cost estimate of some of the US military gears. Do you know how much, for example, a Tomahawk missile costs right now?
It's like $20
$4
million.
million.
And I bet it costs like what, $1 million to produce or something.
It costs $2 million to produce, and I think it's sold to the US military at $4 million. And guess how much it actually costs to produce based on, like, I went to the internet, I checked because I work in like my trade is mechanical engineering, so I have a general idea like how much you need to build this. If you build using US component, using US workforce, it shouldn't cost more than 500,000. Yet it's being sold at 4 million, and it's said that its cost is 2 million. I think my issue with the US military industrial complex is that right now, with all the lobbying, with everything, is so bloated, so inefficient that I mean, a country need a military industry, but in its current form is really need to redo, because currently they cannot get things done. Everything is too expensive, and China brought out two sixth generation fighter like last month, and the US has been saying they're gonna make the NGAD for the last 10 years, yet nothing happened. So in the current form, my perspective as an engineer is that is just so bloated and inefficient that the US probably need to do something about it. Yeah, that's my point.
Yeah, point very much taken. Although I think that's a wider problem of the US industrial base. Because if you look at many other things that are non-military related, it's the same problem. Just dysfunctional industrial base, not enough skilled workers. I mean, I don't know. I'm not in the industry, but my understanding is a much wider issue that this is a symptom of. No.
It went beyond that, because the estimate I did is based on US labor costs and US parts. So even using the US industrial base, thing would not be that expensive. And generally, because I did some other cost estimate in my free time just for fun, and generally, if you check the Chinese war gear versus the US one, we know like China is have a bigger industry, so that brings down the cost quite a lot. But even so, when I did my estimate, if all things being equal, like building something like a weapon, like a missile or something like that in the US should normally cost maybe only like 3 to 5 times more than in China. Yet the stuff built by the US military industrial complex, the equivalent, the same thing like a shell or a missile, it costs typically 10 to 20 times. So that is like an extreme level of corruption and inefficiency. That's at least from what I see. So it went beyond the decay of US industry. It's really corruption at this point.
Interesting. Again, point taken on all of this, but I always go back to, well, what else are you going to do? I mean, are you going to just dissolve all of these companies? Are you going to nationalize all of them? It's always a question of, well, what can we actually do about it?
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
I mean, a lot of people on the Twitter thread, I don't think either of you guys were basically arguing, well, we ought to just have nothing, and China ought to rule over us. I mean, there was someone who was literally arguing that. And so, you know, at least to that side of the argument, I always say, well, is that really better? Is that really an improvement? You know?
Well, let me put it this way, right? So, if we look at and the 200 years from like 1800 to 2000, I think are really important here. So, you know, broadly speaking, we have the long 19th century in Europe, which is what 1789 to 1914. Now, I know we have the Napoleonic Wars from 1815 to 1914. We have, quote, the long peace. There's a few regional conflicts, but they're short-lived, they're contained, and there's no great power conflicts in Europe. Now, that was primarily driven through reasons of state and diplomacy. One of the reasons why the Congress of Vienna was so successful is that Tyrrell, Castlereagh, and Metternich really did want to maintain the situation. They didn't want any one person to get too strong and upend the apple cart like Napoleon did. Now, and this is also the high tide of English free trade, British splendid isolation. So what I'm saying very specifically is this. Production of weapons should not be a for-profit institution. The incentives are to start wars, to arm America's enemies in order to sell more weapons. Now, that's not to say that we should then nationalize all other economic activity. I'm not saying that. And the United States was perfectly able to defend itself prior to 1945 without the military-industrial complex. I'm just saying this shouldn't be for profit because the incentives are to start wars. And those are different incentives than, say, somebody who wants to sell, you know, wheat to China.
The only thing that I would say is where do you go with dual use things? Like look at a company like Boeing, right? There are huge spillover effects between both military industrial research and kind of consumer or non-military industrial research. That there are good reasons for Boeing to be one company with both its consumer aviation division and also its military side altogether, right? And look at in China, a lot of the success has come from this kind of dual use military industrial fusion, right? If you split all of that off and you say, okay, none of this is going to be done by for-profit companies, is it actually better? And the second thing is okay, look, China manages to get things right somewhat in terms of state-owned corporations and state-owned production in general. But I don't think we do. Like the track record, I don't know, you live in the US, I live in the UK. In the UK, the track record is absolutely abysmal for the state actually operating productive assets. And so, you know, do you really want that to all to go into the state? Do you think it would actually be run better here, is my point.
I would like to add...
Rain has to leave soon, so I'll let you say.
Yeah, jump in, please.
Yeah. So I like to add a few last points. So it's good that you bring up China. I would say, like in China, those state-owned business, they're still for profit, and I would say like the Chinese by state-owned is more like the Chinese government can tell them what to do, but they don't really tell them how to do it. So it's more like when you're state-owned, the state just set the objective, but you're still expect to, you know, be competent at making a profit. And I like to bring back the point before, like the fact that in China we have this vertically integrated supply chain. It doesn't fully explain the waste of resources in the US military industrial complex. Like that is more on the corruption side, and it also happens in China. And I would say like the last 10 15 years has been an active attempt by the Chinese government to suppress this tendency where the military contractor, you know, they collude with the general, then collude with the ministers to get the contract, and everyone get a bribe. And a lot of so I would say like this thing will is inevitable, but I think there need to be a mechanism to always actively suppress this corruption aspect of the military industry, because the military industry is different than just civilian industry. Is involved with weapon, is there's a lot of I guess less transparent stuff, so they need to be like more active effort to suppress corruption in those industry, basically.
I think you're right. I mean, it's a non-market industry, right? There's no prices in a sense. I mean, obviously there's a price that the government pays for the output, but the output ultimately is destroyed, right? You blow up a missile, it's gone. There's no end consumer who's willing to pay X price for it and to set the price that can then filter up through the supply chains. It's completely a non-market.
So basically you cannot really treat it like for example, like a car industry. So that's basically my point. So I don't know if you want any more information and the more engineering industrial side. So in a bit, I need to go back to work. So I won't.
Godspeed with your work anyway.
Yeah, I mean, is there anything you feel like you want to add, Rain? Because I think we're kind of up to date with what you had in mind.
Yeah, that's mostly it. It's mostly the what I know about the industry. So if that's all good, I'll be heading out. So
all right,
nice to meet you
I think
guys.
we're great. Thanks for coming on, Rain. Very value your input.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Nice to meet you as well.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, the only thing I'd just say is like, okay, I get your point about all of the negatives of the military-industrial complex. Absolutely. But it's, again, I always go to, well, what do you propose as an alternative? You know, what do you propose as the alternative structure of military output or production of military goods, right? It has to be produced somehow. And that was my point, is that if we don't produce that stuff, we become easy meat for others to pick over.
So so there's a lot of important layers here. So I'm going to kind of work from the top down. And this is where I'm leaning on Sutton really hard. The Soviets, who were far more of a military threat than the Germans in either World War, and then one could even argue China today, entirely exist in the form that they do because the U.S. military-industrial complex built them up. And more importantly, large corporate interests built them up. China was done on the full light of day from the 80s till now. As Sutton shows us, the Soviets were done, it was illegal. So from 1917 to 1933, it was illegal to trade with the Soviets. But a lot of corporations paid members of the government to just look the other way. And for example, the tank factory that helped them win World War II producing T-34 is Magnitogorsk, which was basically built on a design from Gary, Indiana, of an American auto factory, which was completely illegal. This just shouldn't have happened. And this kind of illegal trade was going on in the 80s. He has another book called The Best Enemies Money Can Buy, where the Soviet computers were just discount Apples. Like they were like literally illegally selling Apple computers to the Soviets for military purposes. Now you're right, a computer is dual use, but they knew that the Soviet use was military. And they also knew it would have run afoul of U.S. regulatory agencies. And so that kind of activity has to stop.
It is the point, that basically if you have effectively a capitalist mode of production, you're going to have people who are effectively traitors, i.e. traitors for money. Is that the kind of general idea you're getting across?
I mean, that's part of it, because if you want to treat, so first of all, Rain said, and I agree with Rain, and I think you did too, that weapons production is not really a market activity, though it can be treated as such, for purposes of production. Because like you said, you fire the missile, it's gone. It immediately depreciates in value. So you're artificially treating it as a market good, unlike, say, like, I don't know, wheat or steel, just raw for what they are. The incentive is to make money. And how do you make money? Well, in that industry, you make money by selling weapons. So if the whole world is, steady as she goes, and there's no conflicts on the horizon, you go out of business. So the incentive for these people is to actively stimulate America's enemies by arming them, and then getting contracts from the U.S. government to fight them. And that's sort of the dance of the Cold War.
This is a slightly out there idea. It might not, but maybe it's the case that actually, frankly, these incentives exist in every society, however you structure it, because if it's the case that you need defense, well, then you need production of defense goods. Okay, whether it's state-owned or private or whatever, there are going to be individuals involved in that and who are controlling it, right? Whoever heads the company or whatever. And it's strongly in their interest to influence the government, whether maybe it's the Soviet Union and you're the one who heads the arms factories. You have a strong incentive to lobby people up in your government. And You know, even outside of capitalist economies, lobbying still exists and power networks and so forth. It may just be the case that, frankly, in any industrialized society, you will have this group who produce weapons and therefore lobby the government for more wars. It may just be an inescapable part of industrialized society.
Well, let me couch this in other terms, right? Because I really want to focus in here on the fact of actively arming people hostile to the United States and stimulating conflict. So, okay, let's say you're the Roman Empire. Of course, you have an interest in equipping the legions, building armor for them, giving them the materials to build fortresses and catapults and whatnot. But you don't have an incentive to arm the Germans to then conquer you, right? That incentive isn't there. We don't have Roman merchants going to the Germans being like, hey, I'll give you some legionary equipment, some catapults, just pay me the right price. So that kind of thinking wasn't going on in the Roman Empire and would have been cracked down on supremely if they had. And that's what I'm really talking about here.
But is it in this case? I was thinking about the example of the Soviet Union you gave there of Apple computers, right? Well, that was just a selfish interest. As going back to, like, if you have capitalists in your society, they're probably going to sell you out for money. Is that not just the incentive of Apple in particular to make a bit more profit? Not necessarily this big, much wider, not a conspiracy, because I don't mean it in a derogatory sense, but this wider conspiracy to arm your enemies and therefore to provoke wars and to keep the military industrial complex employed and all of that. It might just be there's, again, like, for example, there's companies that design industrial automation or design factories, for example. That would be a particular company on its own. They had an incentive to go and get some money from the Soviets to do it. I don't know. I'm talking out beyond my expertise, but I wonder whether these are kind of wider incentives that are to do with the wider capitalist class rather than particularly the military-industrial complex.
That might very well be true. Stalin has that famous dictum: the capitalists will sell you the rope that you hang them with. And well, certainly the Soviet Union failed to live up to that threat. I think a lot of people are realizing China might actually be able to do that, and that's got us scared. And the main reason why China might be able to do that is, unlike the buildup of the Soviets, the United States did not gut the industrial heartland to do it. We did to China. So now China has a trump card that the Soviets didn't have. And so that's, I think, one possibility. But you also bring up another point, because I don't want to stay in theory forever. You mentioned both, and what would it look like practically? Now, you mentioned dual-use goods. Yeah, there's a lot of dual-use goods, but we know that an Apache helicopter, a Tomahawk cruise missile, an M1A1 Abrams is not a dual-use good, so for example, and this is also just political corruption, right? During the 90s, Bill Clinton, under the table gave missile technology to China. Probably missile technology that helped them build the DF-17, which can sink an aircraft carrier. I mean, this kind of activity is insane. The Romans wouldn't have done this. They wouldn't have gone to Attila the Hun and be like, hey, bro, I'll construct for you all these siege weapons to take Roman cities in Gaul. No one's going to do that. They're not going to give Attila the Hun that kind of weapon.
I sometimes, again, is this not just liberal, big-hearted misguidedness, effectively? Because think about the 90s, right? Everyone's like, well, China's going to become a democracy, and if we buddy up with them, we can influence them, and we'll add them to the World Trade Organization, and all of that, right? Is that not more a better or a better reason for why they acted in that way, then, okay, well, if we give them this missile, they'll be able to fight wars with us, and therefore we're more likely to have a war. You see what I mean?
No, I do. I think that this is where my perspective is going to deviate a lot from many on the right. And part of this is reading sort of, oddly enough, old right sources that have not quite entered into the mainstream yet, which I hope will. Sutton being one of them. Another one was, and this was it Sutton, or was it it was either Anthony Sutton or the I can't think of it now. That one sort of conservative group that thought that Eisenhower was a communist. John Birch Society, the John Birch Society. The idea was there was that's right. All right. There was an interviewer, Stan Monteith, I was following, who interviewed one of the guys. In the early 50s, there was what was called the Reese Committee, which investigated the influence of nonprofit foundations on U.S. government policy and U.S. institutions, both like schools, libraries, businesses, media, because media was just getting started in a big way. And they found that almost every level of American government had been subverted by these large financial interests, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Fords. And the lead investigator, who was what we might call a small business conservative, said, yeah, the entire American democratic process has been subverted by these corporate interests. And this entire investigation, the kibosh was put on it like by 53. And the research that had been done was just confiscated and it just quietly let die. So what's interesting is the left never picks up on this, which is one thing that's interesting. But the fact that this was pointed out by what we might call small business conservatives, the old right that Rothbard talks about, I believe that what we see is basically acting, whether it's government, business, media, school. Everybody ultimately has the purse strings controlled. For example, most of the public libraries were endowed by Carnegie. Now, Carnegie didn't do this out of charity, out of the goodness of his heart. He wanted to control the American consciousness. And so the books that were there were put there for a reason, and certain books were not put there for a reason. So I would argue that these people do things either to increase their profitability or to increase their total control over the country, because they also need to have control in order to extract profits.
You know what? I think we both found each other in a thread, an academic agent thread, right? So I'm presuming you've read his books. Look, I don't disagree. I don't disagree that the elites control society, that elites do what is in their own interest, and you and me plebs, it's not in our interest, clearly, often. But it's always, again, I go back to the question, what else? Would it be better that our elites were weak and incompetent? Well, they are incompetent and they're getting weaker, but that they were even more weak and even more incompetent, and that we were therefore ruled by China. Again, it's like, what would you rather have? I get that we have an elite dominated society. I get that they work in their own interests and not in ours, but having China as a foreign elite being our elite now, because our elite has folded, would be an even worse situation. They would have even less regard for us. Do you get my point? It's just like,
I do.
The best of a bad bunch.
Well, so what I'm saying here is, okay, if we look at, and this was a common debate that the libertarians would have with like the neocons, what constitutes adequate defense for the United States, right? I see no reason to think that a Fortress America, where like we have just basically a large Navy with a token Air Force and Army, couldn't suffice for protecting America from any invasion across either the Pacific or Atlantic Ocean, which would lead to a much, much smaller military budget. One of the things that the founding fathers were not afraid of was a Navy. They were afraid of a standing army because of what it might imply domestically for tyranny. And Air Force, this wasn't even on their radar. They couldn't even conceive of an Air Force. So I think, a large, well-funded Navy without a large army and military bases all around the world, and an Air Force large enough to protect any potential landing sites would be more than adequate for America's defense, and could be vastly reduced in size, the military-industrial complex.
Take the argument that, in a sense, those military bases and that wider military infrastructure is what allows US corporations to be dominant globally, and you as an American, and me tangentially as a Brit, end up indirectly benefiting from that. Large Western corporations are able to make big profits, and although yes, we do not see the great majority of it, we might even just see a few pennies of it. It means that, it makes our country strong. It pulls resources into our countries. I mean, in the case of the US and the UK, it means we can run big current account deficits consistently, and we still have money coming in to prop that up and allow us to basically overconsume. Do you see my point? Is that like it's a wider structure? It's that that's what makes the West powerful, which allows our corporations to go and dominate globally. And although that mainly benefits our elites, the fact that you can work at at, I don't know, Facebook or something, you know, you're clearly not Mark Zuckerberg, but you are definitely getting a benefit from it. Make some sense.
Well, let me put it this way, right?
Would it be better if we were weak? Is my point. You know.
Well, what you're saying is, would it be better if we were poor, materially poor? Because if this interconnected global system were to be replaced by, say, global economic nationalism, on the one hand, you know, the libertarian or the business conservative critique would be, well, we're all going to be overall poorer, versus.
Can I give a really basic example that's from my country that might make it easier for viewers? I'll give the example of like BP and Shell. Those are two big oil companies based in the UK, right? And a simple example of how this benefits massively the normal population is BP and Shell can go out and drill all around in all sorts of third world countries because they've got the support of the kind of wider global American empire. It's obviously not British ships that are going out doing this because our Navy's tiny, but you get my point, right? But every retirement saver in the UK has a whole load of BP and Shell in their portfolio, which is paying a big dividend. And the only reason they can pay that dividend is the profits they get from dominating global energy markets, right?
Norway does that.
Our pensioners and savers would be fucked without it. They wouldn't, you know, they would need that 5% dividend a year. And that basically pays for a large part of our elderly population, you know.
Well, Norway does this too, but
yeah.
The United States does not.
But you guys do, because everyone holds the S&P 500, and you know, Apple, Microsoft, Google, etc. They make most of their money abroad. A minority of their revenues come from the US. The majority come abroad. You know, if they didn't have dominant market positions all over the world, then they wouldn't be as large companies, and Americans would have much smaller pensions. You know, and would be poorer as a result. So everyone, in a sense, does indirectly share in some of the benefit. And even though it's disproportionately up to the elites, not having that benefit would massively screw over even the normal people. You know, and the only reason that American companies can go be dominant all over the world is basically because America can say, well, if you don't treat our tech companies right, at the very end line of it, there's a Tomahawk missile. Obviously, that's not the first negotiating strategy, but it's in the background, and you can't negotiate the first layers if you don't have that final show of force at the end.
Well, okay, this really, I think, just gets down to the basic point here. We've, throughout all of human history, have had nations and nation states and empires having means of procuring weapons. But what is new in the last 150 years is actively arming your enemies. That's insane. That just shouldn't happen. But the U.S. has been doing that since at least the early 20th century. And that is the result of the incentive structure of this cartel called the U.S. military-industrial complex, which evolved from a series of independent arms manufacturers in the late 19th century, as described by Engelbrecht, and then becomes formalized as a part of this broader Cold War initiative in the late 40s, early 50s. And that's when Eisenhower gives his warning. And, you know, this game, so let's say we have this global economic order that's pouring water into a bucket, and that water in this bucket represents the added value that we get. This system is constantly punching holes in the bottom of the bucket, so all the water leaks out because we're arming our enemies so that they can then attack us. And that does not benefit the US people.
Okay. And the thing is I hadn't read these books. I was not clued into all of that. So I'll take that point as given. Should we go then to the practicalities? What should actually be done about all of this? Because I think that's maybe more, that might be an interesting way to go down.
No, we could. So, for example, there was a really good documentary that came out in the aughts called Why We Fight, which talked about a lot of this arms contracting that led to the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But one of the things that this comes up with is, how does the military-industrial complex have such a chokehold on both political parties? What they decided, which was really brilliant, was just distributing production to all 50 states so that no matter whether it was a Democrat or a Republican, no matter what state, Hawaii or Texas, you're going to have an interest group that will support you, getting contracts, give more jobs to the people there to keep them going. So part of the problem is because of the strategy of diffusing production throughout the country and ensuring that people's livelihoods are far more. So like in 1913, far fewer people were working in the arms industry than they are today. And so, of course, there's a built-in interest group, dare I say a class, that is interested in keeping this going for their economic livelihood. That needs to change. And one of the ways in figuring out how to change that would be the important thing. So first of all, we want to have some form of transition so that they don't just become unemployed and lose everything because we just shut down, I don't know, a Lockheed Martin plant, right? We don't want that. We want to have some sort of phased transition so that they could be put to some other useful work. I don't know exactly what that would look like yet, but we can envision some ideas. I mean, for example, most of our useful productive energies went to China. We could then take those workers, put them back to normal economic productive activity, and then gradually dismantle this octopus of the military-industrial complex.
But again, in that case, but it is what I'm trying to get at is in the world you're envisioning, are we producing, or is the US producing less military goods or more, or the same, or you see what I mean? Because
I would say less, because the United States foreign policy from its founding up until World War I was broadly internationally isolation with strategic interventions in its own region, like say Mexico or Cuba, or the Mexican-American War and the Spanish-American War. So much of the budget would go to the Navy, because that would be the shield, the front line of defense for any invasion. And that was what was envisioned by the founding fathers, such as Hamilton. The Air Force didn't exist back then, but some sort of strategic space program, which would then have like an umbrella over North America, and then a very small token ground army, like we had throughout much of U.S. history. And from the Civil War to World War I, which eventually changed with World War II, the United States could mobilize large amounts of men as needed, but then it would disband them. And that stopped after World War II. And I think that was, again, Eisenhower's warning of a very bad trend that began.
Okay. Point taken on that. I think the thing that I think about is, well, okay, so the US decides to move away from the rest of the world and concentrate much more on itself and on its own backyard. Makes a lot of sense. I think the Trump administration's arguably doing some of that already. But take that to an extremist. What happens? Okay, you shut down all your external military bases. You basically retreat just to the Western Hemisphere. What happens after that? Well, someone else comes to fill those shoes, and I suspect it's China. Well, what happens when China has bases all over in the same way that the US does, and they've got their ships are sailing? And by the way, if you want to have a global naval footprint, you need bases all over the place because you've got to refuel. But ignoring that, say now China has taken over all of the bases or has similar bases. Well, they're going to be in the same position that America was through the 20th century, right? When they say, well, you guys are using Meta at the moment, or the most popular social media is Meta, but we've got Alibaba, and we've got Tencent. And have you thought about that? Have you maybe thought again? And maybe there's a Chinese military ship that comes right up into your harbor. My point, obviously, that's quite extreme and not how things rarely escalate up to that level. This is not the 18th or 19th century anymore. But they end up in the same structural position that the US was post World War II. With all of the consequences. And again, you've just given up global market share. Your companies will be pushed away, and the profits that you make abroad will no longer be made and can no longer be distributed. Again, although unfairly and mostly to the elites, they can't be distributed around within your country, and you are just simply poorer. Is that a win? That's my point. My point is basically, I think that the US probably does benefit more as a result of being able to dominate global markets than it does in its military expenditure. I haven't done the calculations for that, but I suspect it's true.
So to that, there was in the late 19th century, there was in the United States a bipartisan group called the Anti-Imperialist League. And that included both, Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, and liberals. And one of the famous spokesmen was William Graham Sumner, who wrote an essay called, I'm pretty sure it's called The Spanish Conquest of America. And he wrote that as a response to the Spanish-American War. Now, he was arguing what caused Spain to become so poor and decrepit that America could defeat it so easily, given its high water mark in the 16th century. And his argument basically is this, that, and I can get into this in a little more depth, that the cost of maintaining the empire eventually exceeded the profitability of the trade routes and plundering that they could do, which eventually hollowed out Spain proper so that it just kind of collapsed into a mess. And William Graham Sumner predicted that if the United States can follow that route in its own history, it would end in a similar fashion. Because, well, to have worldwide global trade routes, let's look at the Silk Road from history. You do need to have a, quote, security commons. And this was, let's use the first century. You had Rome, Persia, the Parthians, the Kushans in Afghanistan, and Han China. And they all believe that, yeah, the Silk Road benefits all of them. They all contribute to the security commons. The problem is they get into arms races with each other, and at that time with the steppe nomads. And so the cost of maintaining the armed forces is then kicked back onto the merchants by having higher rates of all that stuff. And eventually that causes, they squeeze the trade routes too hard and they collapse, and then the empires collapse, and then there's no more global trade. And so when the Silk Road collapses, that's like the Dark Ages for much of Asia. And so what we have is we have this limit where eventually there's a capacity of profit that any international trade route can hold, and that eventually is no longer sufficient to supply the needs of the perceived needs of a military production. And so it then cannibalizes itself and collapses. And that crater is what Sumner was afraid of.
Interesting. But to me, that just sounds like it's a cyclical process, and we're just towards the end of a cycle, right? You can rail against it all you want, but if you want international trade and the benefits, you need the security commons. If you want the security commons, you end up with the security competition. And, you know, like the logic you presented is very convincing, and, you know, I haven't read into it anymore, but I would agree with it. But that just points to a cyclical issue that it's just one of those unfortunate aspects of humanity that it just is. You know, like how are you going to escape this? How are you going to escape this, to have international trade with no security commons? You see my point? Like, what are you going to do?
No, I do. Well, so within the United States, from its early founding, there were basically two separate ideas of what the United States should be, right? One of them was the Southern planter class with like Jefferson and Madison, the natural aristocracy, the yeoman base. I call that the Swiss model. So Switzerland, in many regards, is Jeffersonian in its orientation, and they seek to maintain what I would call an equal. Let's use energy flows. They seek to maintain an equilibrium. So they're not ping-ponging from very high to very low, very high to very low, which would be empire growth and collapse. Then there's another view that America was going to be the new Rome that would expand and conquer and take over. And now you've then decided to enter into this extreme fluctuation energy flow. What I'm saying is I don't want to be a part of that. I want to be a part of a attempt to maintain equilibrium, which would look a lot more like the Swiss Republic and early Jeffersonian America.
I don't know if there's ever any real equilibrium, is there? I mean, like, I don't know. I studied economics, and you realize when you study it a bit longer that equilibriums never exist. There's always change. It's a very facile comment, but I've lost my train of thought. Do you want to continue? Because
So what I'm saying is, yeah, obviously there's still change, but when we talk about the carrying capacity of so let me put it this way: if we look at total energy consumption in the United States today, it is far in excess of what North America can provide, because it's consuming energy at a global scale. That is, in the long run, unsustainable and will lead to collapse. If you limit yourself to if you seek to consume energy at levels that are at or sustainable with your environment, you can still have collapse. I mean, you know, we had the collapse of the Easter Islanders, we had the collapse of the Maya, but the point is, though, you have longer periods of stability, and your fluctuations aren't as high. They're much smaller, so the shock is easier to bear for an individual.
But the thing is, like, this assumes that, you know, because, okay, in any security competition, there's two sides to it, clearly. Okay, the US decides we want a lower energy system, right? And so they say, okay, we're going to unilaterally make changes to our military expenditure and just generally the amount of energy we put into this entire endeavor. Well, great, but then what if the other side doesn't? My point being is, again, it goes back to when I was talking about John Mearsheimer's realist view. I just don't think you escape this stuff. I don't think you can actually get away from it. Like, conflict is inevitable, and the incentives towards it are very strong and exist whether you have, well, going back to before, whether you have a military-industrial complex or not.
Well, let me put it this way.
You could say, okay, great, we want a low energy system, and then China says, great, you guys disarm, fantastic, and then we're fucked.
But see, this is where I think we're talking past each other. The kind of threat that China represents wouldn't exist if these large financial military interests were not actively propping it up, just like the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
It may have not got its start in the 80s. I'll take that point, but I think people, especially this is an American problem, put too much weight on them, so that they're too narcissistic. They think that, well, all of China's rise is America, and it's like, I'm not actually sure it is. Beyond a certain point and some of the basics, of course, industrial espionage and so forth, but it's kind of up to them. I don't think it was this. It was their own blood, sweat, and tears that got there, their own training of engineers. I mean, nowadays, and for probably the last 15 or 20 years, it's not been, their expertise has largely been internal. It's not just, it's not all coming from the West, but maybe that's just, I have a slightly pro-China bend to my.
Well, I will give you this. I will give you this about China, right? The Soviet Union was far more a dependent satrap than China, because in 1991, when these people decided to pull the plug, the Soviet Union just felt like a house of cards. China's not quite so vulnerable or unstable. I'll admit that. But the point is this: if we look at America's defense strategy from 1776 to 1917.
Oh, and the other thing I was going to say is, like, okay, and they have, like, okay, say you say, okay, I don't want them to our enemies to be armed and to be industrialized and so forth. Well, they are now. So what are we going? That was always my point in the Twitter thread. Was like, okay, well, what are we going to do about how the world exists as it does now? Because they have got all of those expertise, they have got that industry. Well, now we have to actually deal with it instead of saying, well, I wish that we hadn't in the past. And also, you say, as I say, I think it's really it's a capitalism problem. This stuff's always going to happen. It was mostly capitalist incentives to go make money there. It wasn't. Anyway, I'm going backwards.
So the point here with China, most modern analysts in the West argue that China can't innovate. China just copies Western ideas. Do you accept that premise?
No, not at all. Not
okay.
at all.
Because if you did, then we could just stop giving China the stuff and they'd fold. Now, that worked with the Soviet Union. That was the policy that Reagan implemented when there was one of his advisors who had read Sutton and favorably mentioned Sutton. See, survival is not enough. Let's see, survival is not enough. That was done by... Oh, that's the wrong guy. Wow. Richard Pipes. He read Sutton. He took that to heart. He then gave policies to Reagan. And then Reagan started cutting off economic assistance to the Soviets. And that played a part. Again, they invaded Afghanistan. They did other things. But that was a part of what brought down the Soviet Empire. But the point I'm making is Napoleon didn't invade North America. There were enough Europeans to pile on Napoleon to keep him down. I would argue that there's enough people in Asia to pile on China to keep them tied up. India, Japan, all of Indochina, the Philippines. Russia should have been an enemy of China. And that was part of the pivot that Nixon did in 1972 by turning China against Russia. But because, idiots wanted to start a war in Ukraine, Russia and China are now arm in arm now.
Do you know what? I've completely lost the thread of what we're arguing about. Like, I've had an interesting history lesson, but I don't know.
So my point is this, is that the American defense strategy from 1776 to 1917 was totally sound. The only reason why we think that the Germans or the Russians or the Chinese are going to invade, one, they don't have the naval power to do
No,
so.
my point's never about invasion. I like the US is absolutely secure from invasion. You could have almost zero military and not get invaded. It's just simply too far away from everyone else, and there's a guy with a rifle behind every tree or whatever. But it's not about that. It's the wider definition of power, which is arguably more economic. It's about basically controlling production and controlling the value of the production globally, and I think that's more where I'm focused, probably because I'm an economicsy type person, rather than the extremists of will we get invaded or not? Because you could obviously be safe from invasion, but be a much diminished country. Again, I always go back to, like, I don't think Americans realize the benefit that they get from global markets. If you travel around, you will just see American companies everywhere hoovering up profits in other countries, right? And I don't think Americans realize the benefits that they end up getting at home from that. Even though, as I will keep caveating, the vast majority of the benefits, of course, go upwards to people that we might not like. But
okay, so fair enough. You're not talking about invasion, because most people who object to this kind of defense strategy thinking, right, are going to be thinking in terms of invasion. And so, like when like FDR had the ridiculous bugbear that the Nazis were going to invade through Central America. What a joke. But okay, so that's not that. You're making the claim that the American standard of living would decline. I would argue that what we're seeing right now with these elites is that they're already involved in a controlled demolition of the American heartland anyhow, sans shipping all of our factories to China. The purported benefit that we once got, say in the 50s and 60s, is now much diminished. And it just kind of looks like a black hole where they're sucking everything in. The US, China, Russia, everybody's getting sucked into this black hole, but I'm not sure I want to be around when it craters.
Well, it's because American production of goods, yes, but American production of services, I appreciate it doesn't, there are many issues with it, many issues. It's the same in our economy in the UK. But you guys do derive enormous profits. So you go look at the example of Microsoft. Every computer around the world is running on Microsoft, and they are hoovering up profits as a result. There's no factory, there's no one employed as a result, and you might well have had a hollowed out industrial base as a result, but you're still making massive money off of it. And it still ends up going and benefiting the rest of the US. And if everyone were running on whatever China's version of Microsoft were, you guys would be a lot poorer. If you don't have that control over the world and you don't have that military backing, people will be forced away, and you guys will lose. I don't know. I think I've hit the limits of my argument here.
Well, I mean, I think in part what we have done is we have sort of refined where the difference is, right? Because a lot of people would object based on invasion. You don't. That's fine. We clarified that, right? But a lot of people would. And also, too, I'm not arguing that the United States should unilaterally disarm. I'm arguing that the security strategic mindset that we had from 1776 to 1917 is essentially sound, and that a lot of the woes we've experienced in the last 130 years are the result of giving that up.
I think we should leave it at that, because I don't, frankly, and I think someone put it in the comments there, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Fair enough. I'm not as well read on the book. I'm not as well read on the subject as you are. So I think we've been speaking for about an hour now. I've got to go out in a bit. So should we wrap up?
No, here? This is good. I think we clarified a lot. I think right now there's a lot of energy on X right now where people are willing to talk. And I think that's a really important media market to exploit, right? And I'm glad we've had this conversation because I think it's an important one to have. Thanks for coming on, Luke.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, this is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast signing off.